Hello everyone. I'm going to discuss about what Apostle Paul wrote in Ephesians chapter 2, 11 to 22, where he provides a meaningful insight on racial injustice, the issues of racial injustice. Just to talk about the fact that racial injustice in these days is that it's ubiquitously prevalent all over the world. And it's caused by different factors. Uh, in the case of Rohingyas in Myanmar, the the injustice is caused by religious differences, where Rohingyas are Muslims and persecuted by the majority are the Buddhists in Myanmar. In the cases of whites versus minorities in America, the cause could be more readily attributed to the historical exploitation, perhaps caused by colonialism. And as a result of that, the concept of racial supremacy has been developed. The Bible is somewhat, as Bible is provides insight, a historical insight on why racial differences happened. And I could tell you in conclusion that it was the human sinfulness in the broken world which caused racism to happen. First of all, in Genesis, we see that the Tower of Babel, in the story of Tower of Babel, that the people were against God's will in building a tall tower where they were trying to reach and see God. So God willed for the people of the earth to have different languages, and then ultimately to be spread out throughout the earth. And this factor contributed to differences in culture, physical location, climate perhaps, and then appearances, physical appearances, most likely due to evolution. We see that down the history, we see in the narrative of the Noah's sons that two of the three were blessed and the other was not, and some people contribute this as the basis of a blessing for certain races and a curse for certain races. But only thing that I would say is that incident or that narrative could point to us that there was a cause of otherness and perhaps bias and discrimination, whether it was first son or the second son that were blessed, or another son that were blessed. But in fact, even though the Bible Bible recognizes the fact that there are different ethnicities or races. Race is kind of a hard thing to define in real world, where it is not really a tangible thing that we could pinpoint to in such as genetical differences, because the scientists attribute that 99.9% of genetic basis from one individual to another, it's pretty much the same. So this difference in race that we talk about is often suggesting the differences in culture or tradition or habitat, which causes physical differences, minor physical differences. And ultimately, this factor of differences contribute to bias, which is a natural phenomenon, because people often think in us and them. We often think of the differences between two groups. So ultimately, this racial discrimination was caused by God's blessing at first, which was distorted and exploited by Satan. Genesis provides insight on why racial differences happened. It points to the story of Babel, where the human sinfulness in the broken world ultimately caused racism to happen. Tower of Babel was the symbol of the rebellion that humans took against God's will, and ultimately the people were spread out throughout the earth. And it contributed to the differences in culture, physical location, and then ultimately the appearances, most likely due to evolution in different physical locations. We see in Sons of the story narratives of Sons of Noah, where one or two sons were blessed, and ultimately that blessing, which was given by God, was used as the basis for a curse, for a comparison of the other son that was cursed, and that it contributed to for the ensuing generation to interpret that story as the basis for bias and discrimination. So thus, racism was a result of distortion and exploitation of God's blessing by Satan. And ironically, when you talk about race, it's kind of a subtle thing to define, because one human to another, the difference in genetic basis is only 0.1%. Two humans are likely 99.9% genetically similar. And finally, another instance where blessing became curse is a case of colonialisms, where the improvements in efficiency and technology was ultimately used to dominate other people through war. So this bias was ultimately caused by natural phenomenon of how people think in terms of us versus them. So we look at Ephesians 2:11 to 20:12, and it is relevant because Paul previously had problems with Jews about bringing Greeks into temple, according to Acts 21. So Paul is writing about this issue of racism, perhaps not exactly explicitly, but because he wants to address this issue, pointing to the theological truth that every race is loved by God. And I want to point out two things that Paul is mentioning. First, Paul explained that the law was the strong evidence that Jews were the only chosen people. The law was sort of the wall dividing Jews and Gentiles. And this dividing wall, and mentioned in verse 14 in the text, is that it's pointing out to Mosaic law that divided them, Mosaic law. And this law was physical manifestation, like circumcision that Paul discusses, or choice of food. And ultimately, this physical differences is sort of null by Jesus Christ, because the humanity was reconciled to God in one body through his death. So ultimately, this hostility or enmity, and it's a Greek word, ekithra, and it also means alienation, was ultimately taken down. And it was death to alienation that Paul is emphasizing here, which is also death to emphasizing otherness. In this passage, Paul ultimately advocates for a holy and loving community. And in verse 17 and 18, Paul emphasizes peace for everyone far off and near. He argues that all people are united as one new humanity through Jesus Christ. And then ultimately it produced peace. And this peace, according to the Greek word eirene, is that it's a piece of shalom, a Hebraistic shalom, which refers to the wholeness as in all essential parts are joined together. It is an emphasis on communal peace, where peace cannot be achieved by just one people or one race. That through Christ and the cross, all people have access to Holy Spirit and to the Father, and ultimately rejoining that relationship with God, which was broken by sinfulness. And then Paul asserts that the law was reinterpreted through Jesus Christ in this occasion, that all people are built together spiritually into a dwelling place for God. So all people are meant to form a gigantic community in God. So conclusion is that, number one, the cause of racism was perhaps the enemy, the Satan's distortion and exploitation of God's blessing. And that sinfulness made people to focus on otherness and not inclusivity. And according to Paul, that Jesus' death on the cross resulted in death to alienation and focus and emphasis on holy and loving community in God.